Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Breaking the Burnout webinar. My name is Michael Goldstone, and I am the Associate Director of the Emerging Adult team here at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. Here at the Family Institute, we value the importance of research, education, and therapy. Clinicians here practice relationship-based behavioral healthcare and are committed to strengthening and healing children, adolescents, families, couples, and individuals from all walks of life. In today's webinar, I'll be joined by staff therapist Rich Gauthier, Jenny White, who are clinicians on the emerging adult team, along with Abigail Serafin, who is part of our sexuality team and in the larger couples counseling team. Our goal here today is to have a conversation about understanding burnout and incorporating tools to help prevent and decrease the impacts of burnout. Now that we're all familiar with one another, let's get started. How do you define burnout from a clinical perspective, and what distinguishes it from stress, depression, or fatigue?
So I can jump in and get us started. And thanks for the introductions, Michael. So a good definition I think that we can start with is one that was developed in 2019 by the World Health Organization. It's in the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD. And it's defined as the result of chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. And I think it's important to remember that workplace can be more broadly interpreted than what we might think of. So it's not just office jobs, like our work. It really can affect anyone engaged in any meaningful but demanding role. So that could be parenting, caregiving, academics, athletics, and activism, people who are really I know we're in this political season now, so people who spend a lot of effort and energy on the issues that are important to them can also experience burnout. So in terms of what it is characterized by, there are three main symptoms. So we think of physical and mental exhaustion, extreme fatigue, an increased mental distance or negativity or cynicism related to the work. This can look like just kind of going through the motions or feeling like a robot. And then the third component would be a reduction in work-related effectiveness or performance effectiveness. So I think burnout is thought of as it's a prolonged, a response to prolonged unmanaged stress. It's not just a temporary phase. And it is important to address it. I'm really glad we're having this conversation today, because if it's left unchecked, it can spill over into many different areas in life. I think the second part of the question was, how do we distinguish burnout from stress? So stress, everyday stress is situational. It actually can be energizing in short bursts. Like a little bit of stress is not such a terrible thing. Burnout, in contrast, tends to be chronic, so it's not situational, and it's draining. There's very little that's energizing about it. Stress, everyday stress, typically subsides once we finish a task or a challenge, but as I said earlier, burnout can persist and seep into various areas of life. Yeah, I think another sort of feature that distinguishes them, like stress can lead to heightened emotions and productivity, like we can get that motivation to work, whereas burnout tends to lead to being more withdrawn. And there's just kind of a tone of feeling low or more down that comes along with burnout than might come along with stress. And I think depression was the other area to contrast. So they definitely do, burnout and depression definitely share common symptoms, low energy, negativity, reduced enjoyment of activities. But a key difference is that burnout is closely tied to the stress of the work role. So if we take some time away from the work role, often, again, it depends on where we are on the continuum of burnout, but often we'll get some relief just from stepping away from the work responsibilities. Again, when I say work, I'm meaning parenting, caregiving, academics, all of those other things. But with depression, just taking a break from those things typically won't really give some sense of relief. It's just kind of a pervasive lower mood that extends throughout many different areas of life. And with depression, there can be a level of despair that isn't typically seen in burnout alone. So, yeah, so those are a few thoughts to get us started in terms of definition and how burnout differs from some other things that we might sometimes associate with.
I want to give everybody else a chance, just if you have anything to add or any thoughts about that, especially as a clinician from your clinical work perspective. Um, just give us a second.
Yeah, I mean, I think just jumping off of what's really can be really difficult to what Rich just said is where burnout can be stemming from a workplace, but the long-term effects of burnout can be depression, anxiety, right? All of these other things that we're distinguishing it from. And so just naming that can be really challenging. And that depending on the role that you're in, or the privilege that you have to be able to step away from work or not, or in parenting, we can't step away from the work, right? That can just be really hard to distinguish. So that I think needs to be said for those, if you're in this webinar, you might be experiencing burnout right now, or have a loved one who is. And so just acknowledging that it can be a really challenging thing to determine. And hopefully what we're talking about here today can bring some clarity, but then also, I mean, like practical strategies to help with whatever you're dealing with, depression, anxiety, burnout. And we know some great clinicians that would love to help you with any other mental health challenges too.
Thank you all for sharing. Um, After defining burnout, let's kind of jump into the next question. If anybody has anything they want to add, or we can always go back to it as time goes on. We're going to talk about a lot of different things related to burnout, and we'll get there. Um, what are some long-term impacts of burnout on mental health? And we'll start there. It's a two-part question. I'll kind of share how might it affect one's physical health as well. But let's start off with long-term impacts of burnout on mental health.
Yeah, I think, as I said, like, right, can leading to depression, anxiety, anger, irritability, insomnia, right? Kind of when we think about how burnout is stress that has too much stress for too long without recovery. And so the other thing that I think is really worth mentioning too, that we've talked about kind of as a group, is substance use can also be increased as a result of burnout. So alcohol, other substances. It's also used to cope with burnout. And so there's definitely a relationship there to be had. And I think with physical health as well, I can kind of jump into that. If we, again, are considering our body's stress response, so think fight, flight, freeze, and how our body releases adrenaline and cortisol to help us in those moments. Oftentimes in our everyday work life, we are not able to kind of complete that cycle, right? After this release of adrenaline and cortisol are in our bodies and are flooded to help us navigate a situation. If we are not given the opportunity to discharge that energy and remind our bodies, like, okay, the threat is gone now, I'm safe. Or if we're continually being stressed, right, and not feeling safe in a work environment, whatever work is to you, then that stored up stress, right? That's a flood of chemicals and hormones in your body that we know the science shows that prolonged cortisol levels and stress levels can unfortunately impact all of our systems, our digestive systems, immune systems, cardiovascular systems, all of those things too that are going to impact us physically, which we don't need to get into like all of the health risks that come with that. But I think thinking about burnout as prolonged stress and what we know research shows about prolonged stress and the impact on our bodies is really important. Any other thoughts?
If
Happy
I
to.
can add to that, let's kind of talk about this a little bit too. We're going to talk about it more later. But I do wonder, or like an indicator, a long-term challenge related to burnout can also be related to like social relationships, romantic relationships, family dynamics and relationships to children, your family, extended family, siblings, parents. Um, it can, an indicator or even a long-term impact might be, more distant relationships, lack of connection, um, that can really affect one's one's values may be impacted by that, or they're not living their life the way that's really important to them. You wouldn't mind taking it away, somebody.
Yeah, I think that ties into both mental and physical health a lot because interpersonal relationships are a huge pillar to both. They can be something that help regulate our stress response cycle if we are co-regulating in community and in our relationships with other people. And that point too of having a lot of guilt associated with not being able to fulfill those connective pieces of interpersonal relationships and how that really does go along with not living in value if that is something that is really important and can really prolong those feelings of burnout, and really get stuck in a cycle of feeling burnt out. And so then not being able to have the energy to put towards the things that are going to re-energize you.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about just the inherent in the definition of burnout. I think how you said it, Rich, is like personal or work effectiveness, like effectiveness at work goes down as well. And I think that can contribute to this cycle
Mhm.
of feeling poorly about ourselves. And again, if it's a parenting related or a mission driven organization, right? These things that are really close to our heart, especially. Um, that negative cycle can continue with our own self-talk and frustration with ourselves for how we're feeling like we're not able to show up how we want to.
And please push back on this if you guys don't think that this is accurate, but I like to tell people that um, burnout really is another term for specifically workplace depression. I mean, it's very similar to depression. It's specifically related to work and the work you're doing, but if it's easier to define it as it's workplace, school, working depressive symptoms, and that can spill over into, prolonged stress can cause, prolonged work stress can cause burnout. Prolonged burnout can cause a swath of mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, um, that I see in my clinical work quite regularly.
Yeah, it's there is that when we were talking about the cycle, I think that's the name of our talk today or panel today. It can feed on these other conditions. So being burned out can lead to depression, being depressed might lead to burnout. There's the bidirectional relationship between different conditions that we might experience and burnout. And unfortunately, yeah, once we get caught up in a cycle of burnout, it can lead to spill over into other areas of life. And we can have both, right? We can have a burnout from our work roles and we can be depressed, or we can have general anxiety, as well as work-related anxiety. But I think I agree with that kind of definition or that way of thinking about things is more like a work or a situational type of depression. Like burnout can be described that way, I think.
And again, I'm going to move to the next question, but if anybody has anything they wanted to add, or we can always kind of backtrack, that's really okay. Um, how can external factors like workplace, school dynamics, and environments contribute to burnout?
Yeah, I think kind of as we've all mentioned that burnout really comes from a workplace environment and having that chronic and prolonged experience of really the opposite of sustainability. It's feeling burnt out. There's a level of fatigue and exhaustion associated with Workplace specifically, I think because it is like a system that an individual is oftentimes pushing up against and trying to break through. And it can be really, again, exhausting and not sustainable to feel like one person pushing up against a big system that already has its roots, is already implemented. And so I think all of those factors end up playing a role in the individual's experience of contributing to that burnout.
Yeah.
I know we all are social workers here, and so we get fired up about kind of this system, and I think that cannot be overlooked too. And I think to just like dig in the helplessness that can coming up against a system that feels like you can't change it. And so oftentimes I hear of like from in a workplace perspective, that might look like I am just so tired of fighting against leadership or expressing my concerns, right? Like I just give up, right? But in parenting or other caregiving roles too, that can look like, what am I supposed to do? Like I don't have support. I don't have family who lives here. Like there's just nothing, the system's broken. I don't have childcare. I don't have money to pay for childcare, right? So naming that, we have to just name, and I'm sure we will throughout all of this, that the broken systems that we exist in are perpetuating this burnout cycle as well.
Yeah, it's a feeling of stuckness oftentimes, like with parenting. Most often people are not going to walk away from the role of parenting from their children. A lot of times people cannot walk away from a job because of finances or other contributing factors. And so I think there is for sure that feeling of stuckness and feeling helpless within the system.
I think this is a really important place to pause and talk about like the external factors, the conditions in our environment that can contribute to this are it's so important to recognize that this is like when you experience burnout, it's not an individual failure. It's not a sign of weakness. Really, I think one of the leading researchers in the field of burnout describes this as more of an environmental or systemic problem that can only fully be addressed. Like we can only fully break out of the burnout cycle if our systems are being supportive and helping. And I think, as some of the top reasons for burnout that I was able to identify in workplace environments anyway, being treated unfairly at work, having an unmanageable workload, lack of role clarity, lack of communication and support for managers, and unreasonable time pressure. And I think it's really, I mean, all of those things are not about the individual. They're about the organization and the job characteristics. We will talk about like what we can do to cope as individuals, but I think this piece of it is really important. Like just it is environmental, and there are things that can be done. Parenting, caregiving, different set of solutions there. But in the workplace, like we can do things as leaders in the workplace to help address burnout.
Not to kind of dig into the minutia, but something that like, pings from my brain and for me, especially some of the clients that I see, are when there's added people are at their bandwidth, they're working really hard, whether it is uh, what I'm thinking about specifically right now is like school stress, high school, college, the added pressures of uh, getting to that next level. When I think about high school to college, it's very much about standardized tests, grades, getting all of your things together, letters of recommendation, on top of like the other schoolwork you're doing, which can be a lot for a young person, let alone, when we talk about the next level, when we talk about college, um, finding a job or applying to grad school, taking the standardized tests to get to that next grad school if that's your objective. Um, there's a lot of pressure for young people, and I think our systems, our society makes it really difficult to remember to take care of ourselves, take care of young people, to take care of themselves when there's so much pressure to achieve, so much pressure uh, to push through to get to that next workplace, and I mean this in all areas, all facets of life, not just these areas, but this is something that's kind of pinging in my mind as an added stress and added pressure that can really push people away from self-care.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about that research that you listed off, Rich, of, characteristics of workplaces that, I'm not sure what exactly the phrase was, but even just how that list can shape or can be helpful to us to think about, and people here today, right? Like might be managers of people, might have some sense of power, right? A parent is a manager
Yep.
essentially of a system. And how we can use that list even to kind of shape how we might respond to prevent burnout or address burnout for the people that we manage and that we support. Um, I'm not sure if Rich, yeah, you could even like some of those, if that strikes you too, of conversations that we've had prior to this about that.
For sure. And I think, in terms of like actually stepping in and trying to address like some of these environmental conditions, managers and leaders in the workplace can, I think, first of all, it can be helpful to view burnout as a signal that something isn't working. It means that something needs to be addressed. And so asking questions like, what about our environment is preventing people from thriving in their roles, or what's causing my team members to feel overwhelmed? And I think it can be good as a leader or manager to reflect on these and your observations, but also just communicating with the people on your team and eliciting what are the major issues that the actual people experiencing burnout are going through, and what would they prioritize potentially um, to change or to improve in some way. And so I think, that's a big theme I think that will come across throughout our time today. It's communication and connection, and not and like pushing against the isolation that can come up when we're feeling burnt out. And I think this is a two-way street. Burned out employees or staff can make sure that their managers are aware of this. Hopefully their managers are responsive. But also when we're talking about managers and leaders, like being proactive, trying to get the temperature of the team. Like is it really is everyone just really, really stressed and at their wits' end? And if so, then asking about what sorts of changes people would prioritize, and to the extent that you can do that within the constraints of budgets and operations, changing job roles, changing work processes can potentially really help. And this isn't, I think when you start some of these initiatives, like starting out small, using the feedback and taking small steps that are, really intentional and really informed by what people are saying, is probably a good way to go. I think people really, even small changes that are related and relevant to people are going to make an impact.
Mm. I'm thinking too about how, like, sometimes people who are stressed out at work, it might not show up. How, like, Michael, my manager, might know I'm stressed because I'm saying I'm stressed or I'm communicating with my body language, but some people aren't showing that. And one of the characteristics of burnout is lower work performance in general. And so if as a manager or as a parent, if I see my kid or my employee that's not performing well, instead of going to character flaw or like getting curious, right? Like, I wonder what's going on and how can we help? Getting curious and starting a conversation and initiating the conversation, because I think because of power structures, it can also feel really intimidating for employees to sometimes name those stressors or when they're experiencing burnout. So that can be a way that employers can take the pressure off and name it.
I think as you just kind of piggyback off of what you're saying and what came up for me after, when we were all talking about this was really, as in leadership positions, like I would encourage anybody who's in positions of power, whether it's leadership at work, parent, teacher, professor, whatever it is, um, to ask, to have those conversations. It is your responsibility to bring it up in various situations, to check in, to allow for space, to normalize. It's okay to have these conversations. It's actually really, really important.
Yeah. And if possible, starting those conversations before it gets to the point of burnout, because prevention is so important and so powerful if and when it is possible to happen.
Really good point. Prevention can often be easier to address, like taking a prevention strategy is easier to address than the recovery.
Yes.
To get like really granular and maybe more practical in terms of like what leaders can do, like in different contexts, if the excessive workload is a part of the problem, whether it's work or school, helping staff or team members or students to really prioritize what's critical, like focusing on what are the essential things that need to be done, and then maybe de-emphasizing things that are less urgent, whether it's putting them off, like delaying them, or trying to find others who can help with those lower priority things, but really kind of getting clear about what matters most, and bringing whatever energy a burned out individual has to those most important functions, and really kind of streamline all of the tasks that are on their plate is something I think that can be really helpful. And it's so helpful to have a manager or leader who's on board with that and can back you up when you're making some of these decisions.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Rich. And thank you all for kind of contributing to this. The next question I actually have for all of you is very interrelated to this. Before I jump there, though, just want to check in. How should I move on to the next question, or does somebody else have something you want to add? Okay. Um, on the flip side, how can individuals advocate for themselves within an organization communities to reduce burnout, prevention, just the risk of burnout in general?
Yeah, I think finding, well, hopefully having a manager that you can speak with, or finding trusted people within your organization that you can talk to. I think here, like the putting the onus on the system or the employer is really important, but I think advocating for yourself, oftentimes looks like getting your needs met and help seeking. And I just want to acknowledge that seeking help can feel really charged and loaded for some people for a really wide variety of reasons. Um, Again, whether that's in maybe a personal experiences of asking for help and not receiving it, maybe that is the culture of an organization, to look down on others who ask for help. But I think that's just where it has to come from, is naming it. I also think, another thing that I've been thinking about is companies that have PTO. Like if you are a full-time employee with benefits, like take the PTO, actually take it, right? And as managers, like encourage your employees to take their PTO. I know for me, it's like, well, I might need it later, right? And incorporating that into a rhythm of your year too, and using that. I don't know. Any other thoughts on advocating for self in these situations?
Yeah, I think it doesn't always have to be like an outward or like traditionally what we think of advocating for ourselves. I think that thinking about burnout, the opposite of that really is sustainability. And so thinking about for yourself as an individual, what are things that help you find sustainability within your day-to-day life? And for everybody, that might look different. And of course, like we've mentioned, the responsibility most often really is on these systems and these external factors within our environments. But taking that like personal power where you can to create those avenues of sustainability can be really important.
If I can add too, I think it's really hard to know, to identify when you're experiencing burnout, because it sometimes feels like, as we're talking about, and an apt name, it's a cycle. It doesn't always, like, you don't get hit in the face by, oh, this is burnout. Um, it's hard to know when you're experiencing that. And so using language, noticing it, you have a therapist speaking with your therapist about, am I experiencing burnout? Does this sound like burnout? Or, just naming it if you're experiencing some of these symptoms can be really, really important to making those next steps, to advocating, even just making space in your life to connect with the important relationships. That's really imperative. So, with anything in mental health, it's being mindful, it's being aware of what it is you're experiencing before, you can make actions.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good point. It can be very hard to self-identify burnout. I've had that experience when, looking back and reflecting, now that I know a bit more about burnout, oh, that's what that was, all those years ago when I was going through whatever I was going through. I think there's also, because of the culture we live in, like the go, 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 like keep moving forward, like there can be a sense of that, like we're failing in some way. There can be some shame that comes up if we are naming burnout as something we're experiencing. And I hope, part of if at least something people take away from this is that it's not a personal failure, right? It's just there are ways of correcting the situation, but it's not something to be ashamed of. Humans have their limits, and when we push too far and push to exhaustion, this is what happens. We get burned out.
Rich, this kind of is a really good segue into the next question, actually, which is, how can personal expectations contribute to burnout? Um,
Yeah, yeah. So I think in general, like as a high level summary, it's like when we have overly high, unrealistic, or inflexible expectations for ourselves in any work role, I think that is a major contributor to burnout. But there are a few specific sorts of expectations or characteristics that we as individuals bring that can make us more prone to burnout. So one that I have a very close personal relationship with is perfectionism. I think those of us who struggle with perfectionism just have this really strong belief that everything we do has to be flawless and perfect, and just it puts an immense amount of internal pressure on people with perfectionist tendencies. And it can be really self-defeating because even after investing a lot of effort and having good outcomes, it for perfectionists is often not enough. And so that just leads to that feeling like I'm not doing enough. It can contribute to the burnout cycle. So, an antidote here would be really working to be comfortable with setting good enough standards, or embracing like progress over perfection, or, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or sometimes I say the enemy of the done. Um, Another sort of characteristic is like, as we were talking about earlier, like the demand for constant productivity. This is kind of a cultural thing, but a lot of us really take that in and feel like we have to be always on, always doing something. We can overschedule ourselves and under rest, and that just constant push for productivity often can backfire, push us into fatigue, lower the quality of our work, impact our well-being. So taking time to recharge is essential. It's not only okay, it's essential for our long-term effectiveness. And I think some people I think it's kind of a group of this self-sacrificing sort of orientation, challenges with boundaries, not being, most of us not comfortable with conflict, and so not wanting to push back. And I think this comes down to like saying yes, give me more, right? And so especially like in helping professions or professions that are that involve a high amount of contact with people, it's like self-sacrifice just kind of feels like it's part of the job. And we may feel an obligation, and many of us have this underlying tendency to put others' needs above our own. And, being able to say no to certain things and setting boundaries around, this is my limit can, if we can't do that, it can really impact our health and really lead to more burnout. So again, prioritizing well-being isn't selfish. It's not only okay, it's important to enhance our ability to help others, right? Framing it in a way like I'm taking some rest and putting some boundaries out there so that I can be effective in the long run with people that are important.
I love.
Um,
Oh,
yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I was just gonna say, I think that like everything you just said, we can translate that really well actually into the parenting sphere
Mhm.
specifically, and just wanting to name women typically are holding a lot of the pressure to be self-sacrificial for children. And so naming that as parents, that's a piece of that. But I love, one antidote to burnout as well is to get connected with like the bigger picture, your reason why, the making meaning of this, of like, why do I do this? Um, so it's interesting because that can also lead us to feeling burnt out, right? When we're so connected to the mission of something and feeling um, like it's so important for us to give everything that we have, to self-sacrifice for the sake of the mission. But I like that, Rich, of like stepping back. So if my goal is to teach my child how to be a human, right? Then when I'm teaching her how to be a human, I don't want her to feel burnt out as a, whatever, 50-year-old human. And so how can I model for her what this looks like? That is setting boundaries of like a boundaries in some ways is saying I have a limit. Like there is limits to me, right? And modeling for our kids what it looks like to ask for help, to sometimes say no or not right now, because of our own limitations too. But getting connected with like when that can feel really hard and really selfish. Like I'm actually doing this because I want my kid to be able to know their own limits too, and to know when to say, I need help.
Hey everybody, I just want to be mindful of time. We have about 7 minutes left before we jump into Q&A. We have a lot of wonderful questions. We're going to do our best to answer the questions in a timely manner, the best of our ability. We may not get to all of them, so just kind of a quick heads up at the 45 mark, we're going to start talking about the Q&A. But we'll jump right back into what we're talking about. We might answer some of the questions as we're going. So uh, unfortunately, we could talk all day about this, or fortunately, we could, but I don't think we'll have enough time to get to everything. Um, if I can ask just really quickly, or maybe not so quickly, but um, what unique factors are there to consider for people who experience neurodivergent learning and diagnoses? What do y'all think about that and how it relates to your clinical work?
Yeah, I think just for everyone who's here, the term neurodivergent describes people whose brains just develop or work differently for some reason, and we compare that to what we'd say is neurotypical. Neurodivergent people have different strengths and challenges. People who are autistic or have ADHD or sensory processing issues, that's kind of who we're talking about. And neurodivergent individuals can face both the general burnout symptoms that we talked about and some that are unique to neurodivergence. So living in a world that is designed for neurotypical individuals means that neurodivergent individuals are often masking. They're often using an enormous amount of inner energy to conform with a world that really isn't set up for how they process the world. And so that can be really exhausting. And so finding spaces, finding people where you don't have to mask, where you can just kind of be yourself, that is definitely something that can really be helpful. For people with ADHD, there's a tendency sometimes to hyper focus, and that can just lead to like really long hours of overwork before they kind of lift their heads up and realize, oh, I've just spent 8 hours, just going straight through, plowing through all of my work. And so um, finding ways of sort of breaking up our time and building in breaks can be a really helpful approach for people with ADHD. Um, I think, the impulsivity that sometimes comes with ADHD might mean saying yes to too many things. Like, yes, I'm going to take this on, but the reality is it might be really difficult uh, to actually complete all of those things. And then that can contribute to the cycle that we've been talking about.
There's a, I want to say a larger lift, but like there is just this added pressure for somebody who does experience neurodivergence in their life to be in this society that tells, people to be very normative, very neuronormative. And so there's this added lift, there's this added work just to be aware of for yourselves if that's something you or a loved one experiences, um, that I would encourage mindfulness around because that's more work than maybe, somebody who doesn't experience some of those learning differences.
I think that can translate to really any marginalized person or group of people, that pressure to on the individual to prove themselves that they should or can conform to societal norms, expectations, what is typical, and the challenges that are unique around that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a wonderful addition. Um, what are some proactive strategies individuals can use to prevent burnout? How can you share specific techniques for managing daily stress that can prevent stress from escalating to burnout?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this and then pass it to you all too. I think the couple of things that I would definitely say is kind of going back to what we think about the stress cycle that's happening inside of our bodies, um, and finding ways to complete that stress cycle. Unfortunately, I don't want to hear this, but exercise and moving our bodies is it is the most effective way to complete that stress response cycle. But I think that getting creative around what that looks like is really important. For us, and there maybe are therapists that are listening in too, like sometimes we have 5 minutes in between a session. So how can I move my body, right? Sometimes I'm shaking my limbs, like each limb and mindfully doing that. I think, and maybe it's exercising or doing a dance video with your kids or doing an exercise video with your kids at the end of the workday. I think what's really how we can add this extra intentionality around that is to exercise, even if it's for short bursts, with an explicit mindset of I am switching gears, I am purging emotion, I am purging feels, right? Whatever is happening inside of me and completing the stress cycle. So when I was working out the other day, right, every step I was just thinking about the stress or frustrations that I was purging, right, and bringing some mindful energy to that. I think the other piece is, especially for those who are in helping or caregiving roles, nonprofit world, teaching, is having really clear psychological boundaries around your work. We could really get into what that could look like and get creative around, whether that's like mindfully separating after a day. Maybe it's having a ritual at the end of your workday. We talked about how, unfortunately, sometimes the ritual is like going out with coworkers and having a drink, and how that can actually perpetuate some of this, some of the challenges with burnout. But having a ritual to decompress and separate as much as we can. Obviously, we can't do that in the same ways when we're talking about caregiving roles that are 24/7, but especially with workplace stress, having some clear boundaries start and end.
So we do have to start to enter into Q&A, and I know we have this like extremely fruitful conversation. I just wanted to give us one more question before we do jump into that, which is what advice would you offer to those who experience burnout and are looking to build resilience for the future those who have experienced burnout or may be experiencing burnout now, how can we help? Um, how can you build resilience for the future? Uh,
Yeah, so I mean, I think of this is more like the practical things that we can be doing as we're going on the journey to either relieve the symptoms that we might be experiencing of burnout, or like you're saying, Michael, to prevent and give ourselves resilience and the ability to sort of manage and cope with stress in more effective ways. So exercise, having like the lifestyle sort of factors in place to the best that we can, doing what we can to get quality sleep, doing what we can to eat well, just at these sort of foundational things that we're doing to take care of our physical selves can absolutely help contribute to our overall well-being. Um, I think I think the word mindfulness has come up a few times. I think just taking steps back and being reflective without getting, really caught up in all of the worries or the negative thoughts that we might be having about whatever it is that we're experiencing can be helpful. Relaxation techniques, like engaging in progressive muscle relaxation or body scans or even mindful movement like yoga, those can all be really helpful. Again, to support our ability to sort of cope with all the stressors that we're experiencing in life. We touched on establishing boundaries, like getting, I guess, having the courage really to say no to some things, right? And to say, this is my limit. And I think that can be hard sometimes, but saying no and trying to keep our activity level to something that's reasonable can be really helpful. I think this has come up before, like just focusing on what's meaningful. Like if we can shift our focus in our work, whatever those roles are, to what we find most meaningful and remind ourselves about like what it is we love about parenting, or what it is that we enjoy most about our work role, and seeing if we can sort of incorporate more of those activities and less of the things that are less enjoyable. And just social support, I think that'll be the last one I'll say. We've talked about talking with others who are going through it, talking with other parents, talking with good friends, talking with a manager or mentor in the workplace setting. Again, to reduce feelings of isolation, to just kind of express what's going on for us can be really helpful.
Thank you, Rich. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into some Q&As. Thank you all for sharing such wonderful insights. That was really, really great. And we have a ton of questions. Thank you all for contributing and chiming in. We'll get started. What are some elements of any given system or organization where you can find you can suggest opportunities to individuals in terms of what they can control? What is a wheel of awareness that you can recommend using to target opportunities?
I don't know. Can you read that question just one
Yeah,
more time?
multifaceted. Let's start with the beginning. What are some elements of any given system where you can suggest opportunities to to individuals in terms of what they can control? Let's start with that.
I think that is a really, really good question. And like if I had gone through my full list of personal characteristics that can contribute to burnout, one of them is holding on too tightly to expectations for what's within our control. And this conversation comes up all the time in my clinical work. Like, okay, what is within your control? Like, let's be real about what we can control and what we can. And for me, I tend to default to, what's within our control is our how we behave, and so what I work with folks is to identify how they want to show up in the world, and then take action that's aligned with the kind of person that you want to be, and that's within our control. How people respond to it, or what kinds of things that come back to us, that that's largely out of our control. And I think having this mindset where we can recognize that some things are and some things are not within our control is really important.
So anybody else have anything they want to add? That was wonderful, Rich. Next question is actually directed for you, Rich, but also like please chime in, everybody. Can you list those external factors that can lead to burnout in the workplace? Again, you had already done so, but like let's talk about that. That's great.
Yeah, let me I've got some notes from the reading that I've done on this topic recently, so I'm just going to go back and find those things that I mentioned before. Yeah, so being treated unfairly at work, having an unmanageable workload, not having a clearly defined role, so lack of clarity in the role, not having or lacking in communication and support from managers and leadership, and having unreasonable time pressure. Those are the top reasons that the research has kind of shown, at least in the workplace setting, that can contribute to burnout. So yeah, I think those are some of the things to be on the lookout for, and those are largely things that cannot be entirely influenced by the individual, the team member. It's really through collaborating with managers and leadership that we can actually break through some of the challenges and barriers here.
Yeah, I love that idea of like having managers and leadership being very conscious of those factors and keeping that in mind when running meetings or talking about projects and all of that, keeping that top of mind.
Yeah. And being aware for yourself, right? That this may or may not be working for you. And what are other opportunities or ways of managing this, speaking with somebody, or, in the worst case scenario, maybe looking for something different. How might we, another question, supporting an empty nester here, with caregiving or declining parent health on top of work, parenting, etc. How might we encourage them to find support
Mm.
on managing some of these challenges? I can tell you all what my knee jerk is, which is finding a space to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking too, just community, like finding a place to talk about it and hopefully community resources feels really important there. Yeah. Any Abigail or Rich, you want to add anything?
I
If
think
I can really quickly, like remembering if you're feeling isolated in these situations,
Yeah.
that can be a major factor that can increase feeling burnt out, worn out, not having a space to vent or talk about it, but also
Mm.
in community, which is really a pretty major indication of that could get worse.
Yeah, actually, too, I'm just thinking of the guilt piece of that, especially when caring for elderly parents and our children and feeling maybe bitter or resentful or tired or not having the energy to give these people the love that we want to give them, how challenging that can be in and of itself. And that what feels very inherent in that is the need to grieve and to sit with some grief there too. Especially thinking about empty nesting, moving into new roles as a parent, the grief there as well. So that grief feels like a really important emotional element that is worth noting.
And wanting to acknowledge too, just the levels of grief and challenge that come with experiencing burnout from those multiple different places, both through caregiving and both through parenting. And when there's multiple layers of burnout, how I think it really can lead to people feeling even more isolated of having a unique experience where burnout is kind of coming at you from multiple different directions.
Absolutely.
think
There was- oh,
oh, Just going to add one other thing. So, like, I think in terms of practical things that we can do, taking small intentional breaks, like where we can, even if it's like 3 minutes or 5 minutes, just like if you can get into the bathroom and take a few minutes of quiet, just to kind of check in with yourself, maybe do some paced or regulated breathing, just to kind of recharge. I know it's not going to make everything better, but it is going to help ourselves to kind of reset a little bit so that we can come back to our tasks, especially when we're talking about caregiving and parenting, where can't just quit, right? And, many of us parents and caregivers are there. They're on all the time. So finding those moments, and also I think along with that is being self-compassionate, acknowledging that you're not alone in this, that this is something that parents and caregivers experience, and being kind to yourself in terms of how you're talking to yourself about all of the challenges you're experiencing can go a long way.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about control, what's in my control, what's not. What's not in our control always is removing the stressor. What is in our control is managing the stress itself in our bodies.
We are human. We are going to make mistakes. We are imperfect, even if we like to believe we are perfect. We are imperfect, and we need to give ourselves some grace in all these areas of life. I know we're not going to get to all of the questions, but that would be a lasting kind of message I can send to I would send to everybody here is we need to give ourselves grace for making mistakes, for doing the best we can. And sometimes that may not feel like enough. It may not be enough that's needed in these situations, but giving yourself the grace that it's okay. We're doing the best we can. That is so imperative in the society in which we live in, and the various stressors at various ages, life stage changes, transitions, whether it's children going through stress, starting to feel burnt out, emerging adults, college students, young people, um, adjusting to the workspace, or adjusting to retirement or old age, caring for people in those circumstances. There's so many parts of life that we transition into other areas, and we need to be mindful of those challenges, being thoughtful of what that can do to our well-being and our own mental health, and what our role is, whether it's caring for or going through those changes. And so if we can answer one more question, can you recommend a book to better understand how to navigate through rough times? I don't know, do any of us have any recommended research books?
I do have a book. We'll send out, I think, a resource list too, but um this is specifically geared towards women, but it's called Burnout: The Secret of Unlocking the Stress Cycle by doctors Emily and Amelia Nagoski, and I do highly recommend it. It has a lot of practical tips, and it's based in research, so it's a great one.
And
Any other? Yeah.
I would plug, so I use acceptance and commitment therapy a lot, and there's a book that's come out recently this year called Act for Burnout. And I think it's a really nice overview. And I also use self-compassion approaches and compassion-focused therapy. And so this is another one published this year, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout. So for me, anyway, those kind of resonate. And I think there's some really helpful ideas and approaches described in those.
So if I can just wrap things up really quickly, in closing, I wanted to thank each one of you for joining us today. I hope everyone learned something about burnout and how to consider decreasing the risk for it and coping. If anyone joining us would like to schedule a session or help a loved one schedule an appointment here at the Family Institute with one of our amazing clinicians here, or some other clinicians who weren't able to make it on our other teams, especially the emerging adult team, please feel free to schedule via like calling in at the Family Institute. You can speak to somebody at our registration team, or you can schedule an appointment on our website using our collaborative scheduling system. I hope everyone enjoyed our discussion about breaking the burnout cycle, and I want to wish everybody a wonderful holiday season. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.